Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us at this webinar, which is a collaboration between the EEC and our partners, which I'll talk about in just a moment. I'd like to start by acknowledging that I'm joining from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation and acknowledge that people are joining this webinar from many traditional lands across this continent. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present. We are here to talk today about complementary measures to minimum rental standards on energy efficiency and energy performance. All homes should be comfortable, they should be healthy, and they should be affordable to run. But we know that poor energy performance and a lack of basic weatherproofing means that too many renters in Australia are paying high energy bills and living in homes that are too hot in summer and too cold in winter. Setting minimum regulated energy performance standards for all homes that includes things like basic weatherproofing, insulation, efficient appliances, is a really, really critical step to bringing rental homes up to scratch. And that's something that you'll hear from our panel today. We also know that there's less consensus about the possible additional or complementary measures that also need to be considered by governments that might have a role in ensuring that those minimum standards are implemented effectively or building social license for these standards and for action on our rental homes. And that's what we're really here to talk to you today about. The EEC, along with Better Renting, has worked on a project and a research project and analysis of potential complementary measures that can support the introduction of minimum standards. And we'll be really pleased to share with you some of the findings of that analysis today. I'm so pleased to be joined by two wonderful panelists to talk through this issue and talk through what we need to be considering when it comes to this issue. And I'll introduce them both to you now before I hand over to Joel to speak to you first. We're joined by Joel Dignam, who is the Executive Director of Better Renting. He has a background in organising and campaigning across non-profits, unions and electoral politics. He has been a key figure in the Healthy Homes for Renters campaign and I'm so pleased that he is joining us here. And Joel, I'm not sure if I can see your camera on. There we go. And Michaela as well. I'll introduce you. So Michaela Lang is a research fellow at the Monash Sustainable Development Institute. She's a behavioural researcher with a particular focus on improving the health and environmental impacts of poor quality housing. Her PhD examined the energy efficiency behaviour of small-scale private landlords. And prior to that, she worked in local government for many years, leading community engagement on climate change mitigation and adaptation initiatives. So welcome, Michaela. Now, with no further ado, just by way of housekeeping, I believe that there's both a chat function and a Q&A function. Please do feel free to put in questions through the Q&A function through the course of this. Each of us will have some words to say at the start of this webinar, and we're hoping to have some good time at the end of this to answer any questions or to get into any discussion about the analysis and the issue more broadly. So please do use that Q&A function. I will hand over now to Joel to talk to us about minimum rental standards and renters in Australia.
Thank you, Rob. Hello, everyone. My name is Joel. I'm the Executive Director of Better Renting. We're a community of renters working together for stable, affordable and healthy homes. And we've been running for about 6 years. And one of the key issues we've been working on through that time has been trying to improve the energy performance of rental homes. As Rob said earlier, a lot of that work in the last few years has been with the Healthy Homes for Renters collaboration. So I'm going to speak a bit about the context that led to our interest in this work. I think Rob will probably do a great job shortly of talking about some of the findings from the research. So I guess just to recap, the problem that we're trying to solve is basically that we have a lot of rental housing stock in Australia that is of a really poor quality. And particularly in the current rental market, I think we've seen this pattern over years. Renters don't really have much agency about what sort of property they choose. And so we do have lots of people who end up living in these properties that are a little more than glorified tents. And I think we're all pretty conscious of the impact that can have on people's energy costs when you're having to run heaters all winter just to stay warm. Of course, the associated emissions, if those heaters are using power that's coming from coal-fired power stations, or if you're using gas for heating your home, And I think what's perhaps become more salient, or something we're more aware of too, is the health dimensions of that. Certainly from heat waves and also from the ongoing cold in winter, you do see effects on people's health, particularly older people with chronic health conditions. And that's a concern for us as well when it comes to people who rent. I think, I guess to put a bit more meat on the bones there, we hear from renters who have mold growing in their homes, who are really worried about the energy costs, but also renters who just cannot, at the level of basic thermodynamics, get enough heat in their homes in winter to deal with the cold. I've heard from renters who say that, spending $10, $20 a day running heating in their rental homes just to maintain it at 14 degrees Celsius. And I think for me, that's quite an interesting point, that it's not just about making energy cheaper for these people, or even more abundant. It's that the sheer thermal envelope of some of these properties does not facilitate keeping at a healthy temperature, particularly in winter. And I guess in summer too, we're obviously seeing longer and more extreme heat waves that we want to be preparing our communities for. So Healthy Homes for Renters, of which Better Renting is part, is a collaboration of over 100 organisations that has been working on this issue, trying to push for minimum energy performance standards across all the different states and territories. I guess, to put people on the picture, we have seen movement on this issue over the last 4 years. So the ACT, as of 2023, has a ceiling insulation requirement for rental homes, and Victoria began a little earlier than that, but has now got in place a requirement for energy efficient heating in the main living area of rental properties. And they've recently committed to extend that to include boarding houses as well. And then funnily enough, the ACT is consulting on adding energy efficient heating and cooling, and Victoria has recently been consulting on adding ceiling insulation. Both jurisdictions have also been consulting on looking at electrification and getting renters off gas, which is an important part of this too. What we ultimately want to be seeing as the Healthy Homes for Renters collaboration is a movement towards a model performance standard for all rental homes, whereby to rent the property out, you need to verify that it meets a certain standard of energy performance. What we're seeing in the short term, which is a pretty good place to get started, is the sort of features-based approach, which we've seen in Victoria with heating and in the ACT with ceiling insulation. So I think turning now to the research that Energy Efficiency Council has been working on and a bit of the context for that. One of the things I think we were really interested in is getting a better understanding of why, in some sense, existing interventions in this space haven't worked so well. We have previously seen governments try different subsidies or handouts to move landlords to act. And it's interesting to reflect on why that maybe hasn't got the results that policymakers might have expected. I certainly think after my years of Better Renting that one of the misdiagnoses, I suppose, is this preoccupation with a split incentive-based framing, which really treats landlords as rational economic actors who would respond to economic incentives on a sort of homo economicus basis. And I think that is misguided thinking. And I do think that past attempts to solve the problem with incentives in isolation are partly evidence against the sort of split incentives model as a way of understanding the problem. And so I think what's really good with this research is the chance to look at what's out there, not just in published work, but also speaking to individuals who've been working on these issues to try to get a more nuanced understanding, both of why we haven't seen action, but of the sorts of interventions that could help us to get action going forward. And in terms of the political context here, as I said, we've seen states and territories act on this issue. We're keen to see Better Renting is certainly keen to see more states and territories act. But we also want to see the Commonwealth play more of a role here. That's not immediately obvious what that could look like, because Residential Tenancies Acts sit at the state and territory level. And so the Commonwealth can somewhat plausibly say, that's not our lookout. Positively, we have seen the Commonwealth begin to intervene more in this space. Just last week, they committed $500 million to improve the energy performance of social housing. They've previously, in the first budget of this government, had the $300 million, what's now called the Social Housing Energy Performance Initiative, or SHEPI, co-funded with states and territories, again, investing in the energy performance of public and community housing. These are really good initiatives which target the sectors that it's easy for governments to intervene in directly, and the Commonwealth can fund that, and state territory governments can roll that money out. We're really keen to see an expansion that touches the private rental sector as well, which is, of course, where the vast majority of people who rent their homes actually rent their homes. So I guess the question we're asking is, well, what could it look like for the Commonwealth to get involved in this space? The Commonwealth controls levers like the tax system. It also has much larger buckets of money, and potentially putting that money on the table could help to fund useful interventions. as well as helping to get states and territories to sort of, through a bit of a quid pro quo, identify what they could bring. And we're certainly interested in a way forward here, where the Commonwealth is helping to fund different support measures, but working in tandem with states and territories who then require landlords to act to implement minimum mandatory energy performance standards. And there's a lovely little sticks and carrots approach, a 1-2 punch that I think can be really productive in helping to get these reforms over the line and ultimately lead to much better housing conditions for the growing number of people who are renting across Australia. That's about it from me, I think, Rob, as a bit of precursor to this work, our interest in it, and I guess certainly what we're keen to see it achieve. So I might throw it back to you as the MC.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Joel. And that really sets us up very well for the discussion of this analysis and what it will take to get some of these things over the line. And I like it to be thinking about this as what the carrots and the sticks can be and how they interact. I would next like to introduce, I've already given you an introduction, Michaela, so I will, with very little ado, I will throw it over to you. So Michaela Lane.
I'm just going to pull up a PowerPoint. I'm going to speak to some research that we did looking at Victorian landlords. So we being myself, Ruth Lane, Rob Raven and Kun Zhao, all from Monash. And the work was supported by Victorian government, the department formerly known as DELP. And we did 3 separate studies, and each of these has been published as a paper, which I'm happy to send anyone who's interested in them. But I thought today I'd show you some unpublished findings that might be of interest, and also flag each of the things I want to show you today kind of links to some of the complementary measures in the report. So I just thought I'd flag why some of those things are particularly interesting to me based on my previous work. So the 3 studies were a systematic review of the international literature, looking at what influences landlords' energy efficiency decisions, a survey with 500 Victorian landlords, and then in-depth interviews with 20 of those landlords. So this quote really sums up, probably better than anything, what I heard from landlords. If they're not pestering me, I'm not going to do anything about it right now. It would be fair to say I thought I was going to be interviewing landlords about their decisions to retrofit or not to retrofit. But for most of the landlords, there had been no decision. They had never given this any thought whatsoever, in some cases not till I'd asked them. So a mandatory disclosure scheme is inherently interesting because it's a prompt for landlords to actually think about energy use in their properties. Of the people that we spoke to, they had only retrofitted when the property was a rental if they were prompted by one of 3 things. The first being rebates or similar financial incentives, the second being direct requests from the tenants, and the third being need for maintenance or replacement. And we know Joel just touched on it, but many of us already know that these 3 things aren't prompting a great deal of activity in rental properties for a bunch of reasons.
Michaela, I'm sorry to interrupt. I believe that we might not be able to see your slides. Would you mind just there? I think it's sharing.
Much better, thank you.
Thanks, Rob. So with the survey, one of the things we did was compare landlords who'd done quite a lot of retrofitting by landlord standards with those who had done really no retrofitting but self-identified things in the property that really needed to be improved. And there were 3 things that were really significant in predicting whether someone would be in that retrofitter group or the non-retrofitter group. And the strongest of those was concern for the tenant's comfort. So people were almost twice as likely to be in that retrofitter group if they had a high level of concern for the tenant's comfort. Not far behind it was having some kind of relationship with the tenant, even just, having got to know them a little bit since they'd moved in. And the one that was a little bit murkier, but there's something there, is knowledge. So either of energy efficiency retrofitting or knowing about the property. Some degree of knowledge was helping people to have done some retrofitting activity. possibly as interesting is the things that didn't influence whether or not someone was in that retrofitter group or the non-retrofitter group. And those were environmental concern. Some people thought that their environmental concern would influence their decisions in future, but it hadn't in the past. And a whole bunch of financial measures. So we looked at things about their financial situations, mortgages, things like that. But we also included their financial perspectives. So for example, whether they thought retrofitting would allow them to increase the rent in future. None of those things came up as a significant predictor of whether they were in that retrofitter or non-retrofitter group. So it was very much more about social variables. Now, I'm obviously not going to go into this diagram in detail, but this shows all of the things that our research was finding could influence landlords in Victoria. So this is the stuff that we tested. But what I want to flag is that we've got it factors across all three of these categories. So on the left, in the hot pink, individual factors, things about that landlord as a person, their knowledge, their beliefs, whatever. In the kind of grey blue, we've got things about the property, so either the property management or the structure of the property. And in the orange, we've got what we'd called situational factors, but they are things that would affect the whole community or state or country. And if you'll excuse me for being grossly oversimplifying about what we're doing in policy, often it's around trying to change these state or federal conditions to then create change for a whole lot of individuals. We want a whole lot of people to do something different. So what I want to show you now is what we called causal connection chains. So showing on the left in the dark blue, those situational, state or national level factors and how those are flowing through to, in this case, the property in the orange, and then the individual landlord. So in this case, we've got, it's very common in Australia for people to use property managers. Most rentals have a property manager. So that flows through in individual cases to the use of a professional property manager. And then that is doing a couple of things that are really important for whether or not this concern for tenants' comfort, that was our strongest predictor of having retrofitted, actually translated into retrofit activity or not. So if you used a professional property manager, you're much less likely to have a relationship with the tenant or really to know anything about the tenant, and also much less likely to know about the property. So it makes sense that you can have all the concern in the world for your tenant's comfort, but if you don't know that the house is hot and the tenant is really suffering, for example, you can't actually retrofit to improve that situation. And so this is one of the quotes that came from a landlord who used a professional property manager. I know their name and that's about it. I've never actually met them. That's probably how it should be too. And this for me flagged a couple of the complementary measures. Just the disclosure in and of itself is creating some kind of knowledge. And I'd be really focused on creating a disclosure scheme that speaks directly to landlords. So not just giving a rating to tenants, but providing information to the landlords about the property and what it's like to live in that property and how that can be improved. Similarly, any kind of voluntary assessment should improve that as well. And voluntary agreements is speaking directly to facilitating something in that relationship with the tenant. The second one is around norms and expectations. So social norms are really important in behavior. Most of us, more than we realize, we tend to do what other people or what we think other people do and what we think other people want us to do. So again, we see the norm here is to use professional property managers. And then using a professional property manager shapes the norms and expectations of energy and efficiency retrofitting in the property. And what I mean there is we've just moved into this apartment and we've already had our friends and our family come round and ask about, have you got good blinds and is it hot in this hot weather, and talking about their houses. For landlords, they don't get any of that with the rental property. It sort of sits outside of their life. So the only person telling them what is considered normal in a rental property, by and large, is that property manager. And what people were hearing from the property manager was either nothing about energy efficiency, or sort of a, why would you bother? Other people aren't doing anything. So some pretty negative social norms being created there. So obviously, the complementary measure that jumped out to me there was some training and support for the real estate industry to try and shift that. And I would also focus on success stories, trying to get some good case studies there of showing how change can happen and be positive for landlords and tenants. And the last thing I wanted to show you was around capacity to manage retrofits. So in the pink circle on the right, we've got capacity to manage retrofits. So including things like that individual landlord's knowledge and their ability to negotiate changes. But that plays out quite differently depending on the kind of property. So in the blue, at this sort of national level, you've got laws around things like strata title and the kind of properties that are available in the rental market, which tends to flow through to quite a lot of people are owning strata titled apartment buildings and older properties. And for both of those kind of properties, there was a perception that it's much, much more difficult to get retrofitting happening. So the same landlord could have much lower capacity to manage retrofitting if they've got an old property and a strata titled apartment building. And so quite a lot of the complementary measures would speak to that. The one-stop shop potentially could really help. Incentives and any of the information related measures, I would be targeting at least part of those towards apartments, how to manage change in apartments. It's really hard. And also older properties. And I think I'll stop there and throw to you, Rob.
Thank you so much, Michaela. So much appreciated. And I really do encourage people to look at Michaela's research on landlord motivations and experiences in the Victorian context, because I think there is so much for us to engage with about what the different decision-making factors are and how that happens in a social context. So I really, really appreciate your input today. So I will also share screen, and bear with me. I might be a little bit clumsy with my Zoom slides, so I beg forgiveness if so. I hope people can see that one. So I'm going to talk through, following on from Joel and Michaela's comments, I'm going to talk through some of the nuts and bolts, I guess, of what there we go. Okay. Of what this analysis has been, and I know that my colleague Nat has put a link to this research in the chat, so I do encourage you to have a look at the EC website and have a read through this in your own time as well. There's plenty of info there, but I'll talk you through some of the details. That includes our analysis. As a way of starting, I'll say that we undertook this project both with general desktop research and also a series of stakeholder interviews. So 10 interviews with experts and stakeholders from different stakeholder groups around this space to seek out some details about what the different complementary measures might be and how we should be thinking about them in the policy making space. We looked at the different we mapped out some of the different stakeholders and some of the barriers to implementation, also some of the policy objectives of what complementary policy measures should be seeking to achieve. And then there's a whole range of measures which I'll get into very shortly. In terms of the stakeholders, There are some kind of quite clear, but quite important stakeholders, including rental providers, also known as landlords, renters, property managers, and trades and service providers. It's worth saying that each of these stakeholder groups is perhaps more complex than they might appear or might be thought of, and can have quite complex attitudes around these issues. A key actor in this space is certainly rental providers, and ultimately they do have a responsibility for undertaking action to comply with standards. And they vary from large to small landlords, so they might vary, their motivations might vary, and Michaela has talked to us about that, about the types of social attitudes and norms that are involved in this, as well as just those kind of, the perception of dollars and cents. Sometimes they might be time poor or unlikely to upgrade without prompts. Likewise, renters clearly stand to benefit from this, and there's very clear incentives there's very clear benefits to renters from having minimum standards that keep homes healthy. But the experiences and the outlook towards these might vary across different situations, and there might even be concerns about what potential, if you're in a precarious situation, you might be fearful about what it might mean for you, even if the evidence is saying right now that, rental, in the context of minimum rental standards, rents aren't expected to rise or haven't risen where it's been implemented. Property managers have been identified as a really key stakeholder group, and I think an underutilised stakeholder group, in that they are responsible for some of the really key trigger points and decision points. They're responsible for advertising a property, for inspecting it, for going through the whole lease process. And they are really key influences on landlord decision making or activity, but aren't always widely promoting energy efficiency. In fact, are not widely promoting energy efficiency at this stage. And so there are real opportunities for engagement with that and policy responses to try and change that dynamic. Finally, it's worth noting that trades and service providers are also critical to this piece, and maybe that's a broader picture for the entire transition to efficient electrification and energy efficient homes across the building stock. But it really is important that there's good quality certification and industry preparedness to ensure confidence in the whole process. There are certainly other stakeholders that you could point to, and there might be in some situations stakeholders such as body corps or government agencies, others, but these are some of the key ones that we've identified. We also had a look at what some of the barriers to implementation that have been identified in our interview process. And again, these are things that are often being raised by stakeholders when they talk to us about the barriers that are faced to implementing minimum standards. Some of them are about the barriers that would be faced by particular stakeholder groups, and certainly costs of upgrades is widely identified as an issue that would be faced by rental providers, even if it isn't the only thing. But certainly that's widely identified. Similarly, motivation and incentive structures. So Joel and Michaela have talked a little bit about this, but there is a perception very clearly that a lot of the dynamics of the rental market when it comes to energy efficiency upgrades is around these incentives and around the problem of split incentives. And yes, that's a problem, but it's not the only element of motivation and incentives that are there. And there are ways that that complementary measures might be able to start engaging with some of these issues. More broadly, I guess there's other non-financial barriers that exist, and particularly getting into the question of information and the difficulty of undertaking upgrades. So it's just hard, and if you're time poor, and you have to get you have to find out what is needed in a home. You have to find out what you have to do. You have to go and seek out some quotes, and then go through that whole process. The more that can be streamlined, and the more that it's not that you're prompted to do it, rather than having to go out and undertake all of these things off your own bat, the more the entire process is facilitated. And I think that's a really key issue. Finally, I would just note that I've listed in here stakeholder opposition to minimum standards, and this is potentially less a barrier to actually undertaking retrofits in the context of minimum standards, but it is a barrier that governments, I think, identify as a reason why they're wary of doing this. they've identified a concern that they might be facing stakeholder opposition as this, and there might be ways that complementary measures might be able to address some of those concerns, potentially build social license, potentially signal that mandatory minimum standards are being introduced in a way that's cooperative and not necessarily adversarial. And there's probably a discussion that we can have there about the role of these measures. We identified some key groupings of objectives when it comes to specific measures, and the main ones really are enabling retrofit services, and that's really about making it easier to do and addressing some of those non-financial barriers. And I'll give you some specific examples in a second. Changing the incentive structures, so both in terms of financial support and direct incentives, also potentially reducing the negative incentives, I guess, that might exist in different ways as well. And finally, strengthening compliance. So ensuring that there are good systems in place to ensure compliance with minimum standards. And that is something that does need consideration in design of policy and potentially complementary measures as well. Each of the different here's a bit of a schematic of a range of policy measures which we've put up for consideration. And I know that this is I'll get into each of these categories in a second, so don't worry about engaging with this whole listing. But we've grouped them together in terms of enabling measures that once again are really about the ecosystem and the market for rental upgrades and the non-financial barriers. The incentives that are about financial support or financial incentives or disincentives, as it were, and compliance. Each of these might have relevance to different levels of government, and one of the challenging or interesting elements of this entire picture is just in the context of Australian jurisdictions, local, state, and federal. Different governments might have their hands on different levers and might have different opportunities that might interact and intersect in interesting ways. And so some of these might be more relevant for particular levels of government, whereas others might be available to all in different ways. We assessed the cost to government, so the direct budget impact essentially, and you can see that some of them are much lower. So some of them are much lower, some of them much higher. Cost impacts are essentially for the incentives, and we'll get into that. Some of them are easier and more difficult to implement. Some of them we assessed as more effective in delivering outcomes and results in terms of retrofits completed. And we also assessed how likely they were to enable support from key stakeholder groups for the introduction of mandatory minimum standards. I'll talk you through some of these enabling measures. So these are measures that are intended to address some of the non-financial barriers. Fundamentally, they're about the objective of reducing non-financial barriers and making retrofits easier. That might be by improving access to ratings and assessments and make it clear what steps need to be taken to comply. And I have to say, without depending on renters to make those requests. So key amongst those are policy measures which are already under consideration at both the national and also state level of mandatory disclosure of energy ratings. So as Australia is developing, we now have consultation or finalisation of expanded rating systems, including for the first time introducing matters to existing homes, which also potentially interacts with the existing national scorecard for energy efficiency, that enable some of these measures. But there is consideration that's going on for a national framework for the disclosure of energy ratings and the potential for that to be a mandatory measure. There's a clear way in which that improves access to information and potentially access to information on what measures need to be taken to comply with potential minimum standards. The minimum standards themselves, in fact, could also be aligned strictly to those ratings rather than by features, and that's a discussion which I know that some of you have an interest in. More broadly than that, other types of communications and information campaigns are, potentially a necessary but not sufficient measure on their own. But information in general is a really worthwhile government consideration. Supporting home energy assessments, whether through scorecard or NATAS assessments or other models which are under consideration as well, or other, I guess, delivery models, right? Hopefully with a consistent national rating scheme. But there's a range of delivery models for undertaking assessments that are under consideration, and we can get into that in the Q&A if people are interested. More broadly, I'll just dwell on a couple of extra elements of this before I move on to the other types of measures. One of those is about making it easier to do, and that's the one-stop shop services for energy retrofits. Broadly speaking, this is about ensuring that it is easier to do it by streamlining the process for time-poor real estate agents or landlords to the greatest degree possible. And that means that if what the evidence has shown and what our research from Michaela and many others has shown is that it's not, while costs may be an issue, there's a big issue where so often, I'll start that sentence again. If there is a clear prompt and there's a clear pathway to undertaking a retrofit, and a landlord accepts that, yep, this is what we do, this is how we go about doing being a landlord, this is just part of it, and it's straightforward for us to do, then there is much less opposition to it. And there's a much greater degree of acceptance that undertaking a retrofit is just the thing to do. And the way the governments can really, a key thing that governments can really do to enable that is to make sure that it really is easy, and that there are systems in place. Alongside that is also training and support for the real estate industry, and that might take the form of requirements on the industry to be monitoring or collecting data or providing advice about this, or it might include support such as training or government work on developing CRMs and systems and the technology that the real estate industry needs. It might also involve addressing some of the workforce issues within the real estate industry, and we can have a conversation about that as well if that's of interest to people. But making sure that is on the radar is we think an important and underutilized opportunity. I'll move on in the interest of time. I'll move on to incentives and financial support measures. So this is really starting to get into the question of the sorts of responses to the financial barriers that exist for landlords and rental providers on undertaking retrofits as part of a minimum standard. So certainly in our interviews and more broadly in public discussion of this, there has been a call for financial support to enable landlords to undertake action. That ranges across a few different models. So in some cases, a straightforward one are direct rebates and discounted finance. And so that is something that has some history in Australia. Different states and different jurisdictions have direct rebates, and there's increasingly discounted finance in some cases, including through the HOOF program and elsewhere. The evidence shows that direct rebates and discounted finance are not effective if they are not done as part or alongside minimum rental standards. So they're not effective in ensuring upgrades of rental homes if there's no mandatory standard that has to be met. And there are some examples out there of either landlords choosing not to use existing programs for their rental homes, but rather their own home, or simply not seeing the value in doing so if it's not done alongside mandatory standards. And so we think that there's not clear evidence of effectiveness of it, but that picture could change significantly in the context of mandatory standards. More broadly, I guess, all of these there's value if considering these for in policy design to be considering the ways that they might be conditional. So when they might be for only if you go beyond minimum standards, for example, installing solar as well as meeting all of the energy performance requirements, or acting before you're required to. So doing it, a year or so before before the regulations come into effect. For example, those are just there's a lot of different ways you could design that, but that's just to give you an indication. They may also be conditional on not increasing rents. So a concern that has been raised by many stakeholders is that if they are seen as money being directed to landlords who then charge more to renters, then they'll be very limited. So there are real fairness concerns, and there'll be real limitations to the social license that you could have to introduce any of that. And so I think there has to be very clear consideration of that in designing any policy like that. More broadly, there's some other models of financial support for rental providers, targeted white certificate schemes. So based on REPS in SA or VEU or other. Yep. So there's a range of different ones. In the case of REPS, there's consideration of targeting, so setting sub-targets of the number of certificates that you can generate that have to be met through upgrades of low-income or rental homes, and so that is a potential policy mechanism. It has a lower budget impact, potentially has less visibility as well. And that's something that can be considered by policymakers in designing something like that. It's worth noting that renters already pay into white certificate schemes through their energy bills, but are disproportionately unlikely to receive those rebates where they do exist. And so there is an interesting discussion to be had there. Finally, and once again, in the interest of time, I'll sort of whiz through. Tax concessions for rental providers is something that has been raised, and in survey responses has been seen as the most attractive incentive for amongst landlords or rental providers. So by a small margin compared to the other ones, but it's certainly something that comes up in this discussion. It does, of course, come at a cost. There are models that are available at different levels of government, and each level of government may have options available to them. So at the federal level, that might be conditionality of existing incentives and people, so for example, you wouldn't be eligible for capital gains tax discounts unless you meet or exceed certain standards or thresholds on energy performance. It might also, there are much more straightforward or lower. There are other options that are straightforward as well, and a key one that certainly that we raise and certainly is under consideration, I know, is to reclassify energy upgrades from capital expenses to maintenance, which would allow you to claim it all in the current year instead of at 2.5% over 40 years, and that would potentially have a material impact. Each of these at the state level, the key one that's identified by stakeholder groups is land tax levies and discounts, and at the local level, discounts on council rates or differential rates are options that are available. So I went forward. I would, once again, those are issues that potentially have some of the same social license questions and careful design consideration that would need to be undertaken in designing those policies. Finally, I just want to note that we've also included shifting responsibility for gas connection fees from renter to rental provider, i.e. At the moment, if you are renting, you pay the daily fee of sort of roughly $1 a day. If there's still gas and your home hasn't been electrified, but you have pretty limited capacity to directly change that yourself. And that is one way of bringing gas bills into line with water bills as they are at the moment, where the landlord is responsible for those. And that is a way of changing some of the disincentives that exist. Finally, I'll just conclude on compliance. And so this is a key consideration. Measures available, including external audit, compliance audits and dispute resolution. People might be aware already of the Victorian government's work on a rental task force and trying to bring in new dispute resolution mechanisms that try and bring disputes away from the tribunal into a new body to make it more straightforward. but there's certainly a range of measures that can be considered when it comes to compliance. I will just conclude on some of our recommendations coming out of this work. So first, complementary measures that address non-financial barriers. We think that the conversation should not be solely about the financial barriers that are faced in financial incentives, but we do have to make sure that non-financial barriers and enabling measures are central in the way that governments think about complementary policy measures. Financial support or incentives may be considered as a response to financial barriers. Where possible, policy measures should leverage existing decision points and processes. And a key example of that is the way that real estate agents can be brought into this picture effectively. Finally, governments should consider the role of complementary measures in social license, both to improve social license for minimum rental standards themselves, and also to ensure that any complementary measures that are considered are done in a way that that is collaborative, that is consultative, and is not presenting any risks of fairness or impacts on social license for the broader policy. And I think that that's something that needs to be considered quite carefully. So on that note, I will leave it there and I'll stop sharing my screen. And I see that a few comments have come in the chat and Q&A, and I might ask Michaela and Joel to turn on their cameras, and we're going to get into the Q&A. I'll also just bear with me for one moment because I'm just reading some of these questions straight after closing my screen. So so my apologies if I am a little bit slow at doing that. Well, I'll start off with a question from Nova. Thanks. Please tell us more about the one-stop shop. And so I'm certainly very happy to talk to that. But would either Michaela or Joel like to comment on that one?
Go for it.
No worries. I'll have a drink of water. So a one-stop shop. There's real scope and I think a need to ensure that we're addressing this problem that at the moment, if you want to get upgrades done, you basically are on your own to go and get an assessment done, research on your own, get information, then potentially shop around to different providers, work out what the rebates are, and you sort of have to do a lot of that by yourself. There's real value, and we can draw on international examples of programs in other countries where that's all brought into one desk and you know, a one-stop shop, as it were, where you contact one organization or one person. They can facilitate an assessment. They can put you in contact critically with certified and trusted providers who might be on a register of certified providers. They can connect all of that with the finance options, including rebates, and basically facilitate that whole process. Different states and territories and local governments are considering models like this. In the case of a country like Ireland, I encourage people to look up what they do. They have one office where they really do an entire retrofit package for you and integrate that with finance. And they've been really, really successful in making that happen. And I think there's a real lesson there for Australia that honestly could be something that the federal government can have a role in, as well as states and local governments and you know, other stakeholders too. I could probably talk at you about that for quite a while, but I think that is something that really does warrant consideration.
I might just add that trust is something that came up a bit in our research. People really were saying, yep, ratings sound fine by and large, is what landlords said to us, but they need to be fair. We need to trust them. We need to know the rigor. And the one-stop shop also is about building trust.
Absolutely. Onto an element of trust, I think, or something that potentially has some relationship. And this is a question from Tom Curtis, and my apologies that I'm reading these in no particular order just while I'm coming off speaking. What steps can be taken to strengthen the compliance process and shift the responsibility from tenants, ensuring that rental properties consistently meet minimum standards? Implementing a robust oversight system would not only enhance energy efficiency outcomes, but also protect renters from unfair housing practices and reduce the risk of energy poverty. I know this is something that both of you have done plenty of work on, but Joel, can I throw this one to you?
Yes, thank you, Rob, and thank you for the question, Tom. I think the first step certainly is just recognizing how central this is, that it's not as simple as just passing some regulations and then walking away. And I think in some ways, what this also does is it strengthens the case for those complementary measures. Because I think if you are making it hard for landlords to comply with the regulations, you're going to have much more non-compliance. I think it's pretty straightforward. And so given the difficulty for renters of self-enforcing, there's a lot of value in let's anticipate the things that might make a landlord stop complying, stop on that journey, and let's try to make sure we can really lubricate that pathway so the landlord who sort of wants to comply isn't facing hurdles along the way. At the end of the day, though, I think this was one of the final things Rob spoke about at the interventions. You do need to have a way of enforcing the standards that isn't just relying upon renters to self-advocate. I think Victoria's done some good experiments in this space around enforcing some of their issues around housing standards and basically having some sort of third party that would play that role. We'd want to model where that third party is being proactive, but can also accept referrals. So renters can report properties. And then whatever you can do to strengthen the overall position of renters will help as well. So in a number of Australian jurisdictions now, renters are protected against unfair eviction. That does give renters a stronger foundation if they do want to speak up. And that's sort of a key thing that we want to be seeing as well.
Fantastic, fantastic. So getting on to the question of supported home energy assessments. So you mentioned supported home energy assessments. VE already does this, and we offer fully rebated assessments to renters across Victoria with no cost to them. I can take that one on, but also welcome other panelists to jump in as well. Absolutely. I think that there needs to be more. I think that there needs to be increased building of this. I'm really heartened by the development of a national framework for minimum standards that can build on what the Victorian example of inclusion of the scorecard in the VEU does. My understanding or my approach to this would suggest that the most effective way of ensuring that assessments are taken up and are supported and are grown to the greatest degree possible is to ensure that there's a mandatory standard, a mandatory requirement for minimum set for assessments and ratings. So you should have to disclose what the rating of a home is when you sell it or lease it out. There is a real issue when it comes to making sure that renters are included in any ratings disclosure scheme, because what we've seen in some locations and in the ACT, there has been a mandatory disclosure scheme for a number of years, but it's primarily been for owner-occupied homes or homes for sale rather than homes for lease. And that it means that there can be some real gaps faced by renters, or even the homes that have the lowest ratings simply don't have their ratings disclosed at all. And so, making sure that rental homes are included in those schemes, I think, is a really important consideration. I will take the chance to throw this question, which is to both Joel and Michaela, and I'll ask each of you to take this one on. What do you see as the best first step policies that you'd like to see Commonwealth Government implement, perhaps from those Rob outlined, but by all means feel free to throw in other ones as well. Anyone who'd like to jump?
I can. I mean, I was looking at the question thinking what my answer would be. I think I've got a few thoughts. So I think Michaela makes a good case for some of the benefits of disclosure. And I think I'm often skeptical of disclosure because governments, I think, want to use it as an alternative to action in this space rather than as a step towards further action. So if it was actually a first step and not a last step, I think disclosure could be good. And I think Michaela pointed a bit to how that can work. You're just sort of making a landlord think about their property in another way, getting that prompt. I think for some cases, if we were moving towards a mandatory framework, that would be helpful. Another thing and I guess, yeah, for the Commonwealth, the role there could be funding, getting a framework in place and potentially funding the assessments that might be needed for that. I'm also really interested in either funded assessments and or a one-stop shop. And I think the two can go together because the person who does your assessment can basically become your liaison with the one-stop shop system. And ideally, they really step you through the process and become your cicerone. And I think those things are a really important step that sort of show, as Rob said, a collaborative approach to getting this change done at the same time as putting in place mandatory standards to know that we are going to have to that we are going to get it done and not just relying upon voluntary action.
Yeah, so I would agree with that. The mandatory disclosure is interesting and important. It gives us good data about what's going on in houses that we don't currently have. And it does give you that information baseline, but we've all, I think, said information alone is not going to get us there, and we can't assume that that disclosure means that the market will magically fix itself, right? We know renters don't have that kind of choice at the moment. But yeah, so I've already talked a little bit about how you would make that speak directly and engagingly to landlords, which is very much for us a tenant comfort framing. The other thing I would put in is, and it would be very big and very difficult, but trying to get a shift in the real estate industry. More than 3/4 of rental properties in Australia have a professional property manager. And I think if you're trying to shift a large group of people, you want the group that are professionals rather than the 1,000, 1,000 more amateur landlords. I think it's although it's difficult, it's easier to shift a group of professionals. There should be some more levers there that we can pull.
And I'll take that chance to segue into a question that came to you, Michaela. Is the use of a property manager causative of disinterest in retrofitting, or is it correlational? So is a landlord who's less interested in the property already, are they the people who are most likely to use a property manager? Or is it property managers themselves who are driving the disinterest?
It's probably both. So some of the landlords I spoke to said things like what was in that quote that I showed of like, that's how it should be. There should be a distance. To be fair on landlords, sometimes things do go horribly wrong. Properties get trashed, people don't pay rent. They want that sort of distance to be able to, they want the real estate to be the bad guy in the relationship. So there's a choice there to not have a relationship. That's not necessarily aligned with the choice not to improve the property. But equally, if you're not interested in the property, not interested in improving the property, you probably would have a professional property manager. Flip side, there were people who very much cared about their tenant, wanted to do the right thing, but didn't know what the tenant needed, didn't know what was going on in the property. So at the most extreme example, I had someone who was almost a bit cross that the tenant hadn't told them that the property needed all these improvements, which if you haven't rented recently, you come with a different set of assumptions about how the tenant might feel about making demands about getting changes in their home. Yeah, so I think it's both.
Fantastic. Fantastic. It's a really, really interesting area. I'm very conscious that we're 1 minute from time. I've got a few questions that come in about one-stop shop, so I'll just address them really briefly, but I'll put both Joel and Michaela on the spot to have the last word after I do so, and to ask you, what's the one takeaway that you would like people to have out of this when thinking about this issue of what else we can do alongside minimum standards? While I give you a very brief thinking time about that one, I'll just note that we've had some questions about one-stop shops, and basically, do we already have models? Is Energy Consumers Australia considering that? Is it something that Bright is already doing, or is it like solar quotes? Is it private or is it public? There's a lot of different models there, and I think that that's something that I think that we're looking forward to getting in touch, being in contact with members and the broader community more broadly than that. I think that there's some certain, there are different models. They can be private, they can be public. I think that there are things that public models that incorporate all of the public information, public certification processes and so on, perhaps in partnership with private providers even, or private facilitators of the architecture of the one-stop shop. Can really do things that are needed here. So I think watch this space, but keen to have further conversation about that, and we could have another couple of webinars about it. On that note, I will leave it. I will go to Joel and then Michaela for a last word about what's one takeaway you'd like people to have from this.
Thank you, Michaela. I'll get the second to last word. Look, I would recap what Rob said in his recommendations, just the value of working on those non-financial barriers. I think this is actually a really important insight because I think some of the most important areas of intervention, which I would say are those non-financial barriers, are actually the ones that are less costly for government to intervene in. So it's not saying you need to put, billions and billions of dollars on the table, but I think with the right targeted intervention, you can actually unlock a lot of goodwill. And alongside mandatory standards, really help to get the action happening. So I think that's actually quite a good bit of news coming out of this research. In some ways, it's harder to develop such a program rather than to say, we'll put a bunch of money there and tweak the tax code. But I think it is ultimately certainly less costly to the budget and more impactful.
I'll add on that rather than taking the last word and just say I would frame all of those in terms of the tenant's experience of living in the house, and that's how whatever it is that you're supporting benefits the property and the landlord. I would frame that as a benefit to the landlord to have happier, healthier, more comfortable tenants.
Thank you so much to both Joel and Michaela, and to everyone who's been involved in this project and putting on the webinar. I'd like to thank Philippa and Nat from the EEC who are here with us and making the wheels turn on this, and it's so greatly appreciated. The research is available on the EEC website, and I believe it's been posted in the chat. I do encourage you to read it and to feel free to contact me with any questions or chances for further discussions about it. Once again, thank you so much, and we will call it a day there.
Thank you all.
Thanks, folks.